I'd like to take you a step back and just take a look at our behaviors in the sow barn. I'm going to challenge you with 2 points and hopefully take you through the reasons why I come to these points. Number one is it's hard to identify a worse product failure in our systems than our sows. We try to get 5, 6, maybe 7 litters out of them, and according to our PigChamp records, most farms have a product failure of 60-70% of the sows. They just don't meet expectations. And that can either be due to the fact that we who are culling the sows are not culling them correctly, or it can be that they're actually failing in many cases. What Mark shows is some processes that will really lead to that product failure, that integrally they cannot do the correct job. Second of all, as an epidemiologist, what I want to challenge you on is in culling we have a choice and sometimes a conflict between looking at the sow card, looking at historic records, and looking at the sow, and asking which one's a better predictor of what's going on in the future. It may be we should go further and look inside the sow in some of those details. Oops, it is backwards. Thanks. And so I'm going to take a look at sow culling and take you through some ideas on how to not only improve productivity, but the quality of the progeny. Because I think the decision for culling involves both those decisions. I'm putting lameness in the mix, and that's my bias based on some of the research that Anil and I have been doing along with others, because lameness is one of those multi-cost diseases. It goes well beyond productivity to welfare, to replacement costs of the animal, to the involvement of extra labor on the farm, to simply the logistics of handling these animals on the farm. Our major treatment at this point for lameness is culling. It's pure and simple. And we have to address that as a treatment. Unfortunately, lameness is not measured until that decision point, and we use that decision point and the identification of lameness as culling as a validation of our decision, and it's a useless measure. Measuring lameness at culling doesn't tell us very much, and it's not well controlled. We've got many problems on our farms. The other thing I want to take you through is a simple question as we look at culling is, are pigs per sow per year and pigs per sow space per year correlated? In other words, do you get more out of your farm as you get more pigs per sow per year out of your sows? To a certain extent it's true, but in many cases it's not true. If they are, what we do each time, if they're perfectly correlated, when we do something to improve pigs per sow per year, it should improve pigs per sow space per year. But culling is an example of an intervention that can improve pigs per sow per year, but if you end up with an empty sow space, it reduces pigs per sow space per year. And the way we look at culling has historically been on pigs per sow per year, and that may actually lead us in the wrong direction. How do I want you to look at the sow herd in this example, in this presentation? I say it's like a feed mill. You're trying to deliver a certain amount of feed or pigs according to the schedule and within specifications. It's usually a consistent genotype. It's a consistent size, or at least exceeds a minimum size. It's a consistent age, or at least is below a cutoff age or above a cutoff age as well. And it's consistent or minimized in disease status. And we're trying to control costs while we're meeting all those specifications. Sorry, I'll learn the same mistake. where do we see in sow records or farm records divergence from those aims? First of all, in production per week, we're sometimes under, we're sometimes over. We see it in quality of progeny, proportion underweight, proportion overage, proportion diseased, and in the cost of producing those pigs. Over time, with a fixed enterprise, with mostly a fixed set of costs, it's surprising how much replacement cost as a controllable cost on the farm actually enters into that divergence from budgets. And it can be, through the replacement rate, it can be due to reductions in salvage costs, it can be due to changes in the rate of replacement as well. So culling versus retaining. I've had a student, Stephanie Retton-Ramus, look at this for quite a while, and it's surprising how complicated it is. There isn't a more complicated subject if we look at the records on the farms. First of all, we have to have a question is how much do we take herd versus sow characteristics into the decision matrix? And I'll show you an example of that. Where is the burden of proof? Does a sow have to prove she's okay until she's not? Or do we get rid of her and assume we made the right decisions and pat ourselves on the back because we culled her when we really don't know what happens afterwards? We don't know how predictable our culling decisions are, and we need to test those in more detail. How do we measure and predict durability in our systems? What makes a good sow? What makes that durable sow? Both in terms of productivity and in terms of structure. And there's a lot of discussion, but the stats are a bit messy. Are we assessing for repeatable or mechanical traits? That gets back to my sow card versus sow characteristic aspect, and we haven't separated those out. Are we biased by that quantitative data? I'd argue that more and more we're reliant upon quantitative data as the people who manage the gilt supply and in turn manage the culling decision look at the numbers from PigChamp, when there's a lot going on inside the sow as well, and in that herd that can be identified by the herdsman. What are our opportunities? To increase sow retention, to decrease lameness, to improve the reproduction or at least change the expectations. That in turn creates more stable gilt requirements, decreases the variation in output over week, over season, and the like, and there's real losses there. There's lower gilt production costs, the better welfare of the animals, better image, and I think in the long run an ease of production as we stabilize and increase the durability or longevity of our animals. Lameness versus retention has been measured in a couple studies by ourselves. We don't see very much on that basis. We have to have characteristics at entry of these gilts or entry into the farrowing crates versus retention. We need prospective studies. Just to explain, I say lameness at culling doesn't tell us anything because we first of all don't know what the likelihood of a lame sow being culled. So we don't know how many were left in the herd that were still lame versus the ones that were culled. What we really need is diagnoses on the sow card to prospectively look at what happens to the sow after she becomes lame. And we have very little data that way. We have to identify compensatory changes in what we do, whether we're changing the housing, whether we're changing the management, whether we're manipulating our gilt litters differently in response to that problem of retention. And just to emphasize our retention problem again, this is a common attrition curve, and this is all failure of the animals to meet expectations. We should also recognize that there are times when retention is particularly a challenge or an opportunity to change. And there's manipulations that we can do, especially days post-farrowing after that weaning period. And over time, there's various challenges. Before weaning, before that 20 days, it's a lot of mortality or really catastrophic failure of the sow. There's culling due to maturity or old age, but a lot of it's due to various concerns about productivity. And then we've got the late fallouts as well. So in my terms, as we go through the analysis, I'm going to argue there's two types of culls. There's good culls that we should celebrate and should never show up in a culling rate. In other words, they're the ones we should celebrate. She's sold due to old age. She's sold at a full value because she's still got good condition. She can walk well. She's sold at weaning when we have a predictable time for replacement back into that sow space. And there is that replacement actually available. And that replacement gilt is well prepared. Bad culls, they're culled young. They're culled for welfare reasons. They're culled at other times due to weaning and without a prepared replacement available, and I'd say for the wrong reasons as well, trying to improve productivity without substantiation. So we've got good culls versus bad cull ratios or percentages. Good culls end up being somewhere between 2 and 26% of total culls in the measures that I've had at this point, and a lot closer down to around that 10% than up around that 26%. We've looked at, for instance, in this one system, across different farms that we have different removal rates, including mortality, by parity. And this is same genotype, same disease background, same diet being available. And the proportion actually coming through and maintained in the herd varies widely. Take a look at those yellow squares near the top at the beginning. It simply means there's very few sows left to cull at the end. And likewise, if we take a look at the green dots, they're low at the beginning and very high at the end, suggesting that there are management decisions or management interventions that allow quite varied patterns of retention within the herd. And so my criticism of sow records, and those of you who have been colleagues for a while, this sounds sort of radical, saying sow records can lead you down the wrong way because it assumes homogeneity of the animals that you're describing. Whatever's not in the data means we assume every sow is exactly the same. And I call it the tough sow theory, that we assume every sow is tough until she disappears. And that, in fact, is not true in many cases. I argued culling rate, and going along with Tom, there are bad numbers in performance monitor. I think culling rate is one of those. It mixes my good and bad culls. It's very unstable, even under similar pressures. You essentially need 2 years of data to start getting a pattern in many, or understand interventions. It's driven as much by behavior as biology. It's driven by breeding targets and gilt availability and less by what the sows look like. We've talked in the past about alternatives. Retentions by second or third farrowing often is a good measure of understanding what's going on in the herd. Bad cull, good cull ratios and attrition curves all give better characterization of some of the challenge that we actually have. The aim of a sow herd and fitting successive culling really fits into the aim of filling the barns week by week with the same number of high-quality pigs. And the metrics we're going to fit culling in are more and more, how many weeks do you not meet target of producing adequate number of high-quality pigs? And the proportion of wean pigs outside of quality specifications. And finally, utilization of capacity. Pigs per sow space per year, I think, is a better measure than pigs per sow per year. In that very rigid set of expectations is a very pliable or variable population. What I'm trying to show here, and I showed this a number of years ago, was that over different farrowing groups, we can see varied proportions of the proportions of parity backgrounds within each parity group. For instance, the blue represents P1 as a proportion of the farrowing group. P2 to 5 is the middle portion, and the top is the older sows that are getting ready to be culled. And that in turn creates a supply of wean sows that is highly variable, and it's difficult to make a consistent culling decision on top of that, not only variation in supply, but variation in demand in some cases as well, especially if we expect lower farrowing rates. Put on top of that physical characteristics of the sows. And I'm emphasizing claw lesions, lameness in much of what we do. And what we do when we don't pay attention to the physical aspects of the sow is we cull for productivity. And voluntary culling, as it's often called, is based on this idea of future productivity of that sow. You're betting on that sow is either going to produce as well or not as well. The thing that I've learned over time is that voluntary culling works best when you're at a high productivity. That when your farrowing rate is high, then you have a high ideal that a poor productivity sow is actually due to the sow. When you have low overall farrowing rate and low overall productivity, it's hard to blame the whole herd. And yet that's exactly what we're doing. And if you're into stats, this gets into something called Bayesian statistics, that the environment around that sow is also a predictor of how that sow will perform. And unless we take that into account, our culling decisions are incorrect. The worse the herd is in performance, the less predictable is sow culling for productivity. And that's a big lesson that has often been missed in the industry. That we can, and in some ways, culling for productivity should go down as the herd productivity goes down. And we see the exact opposite in the industry. And statistically, it's not justified. You can't cull to good herd productivity. And on top of that, as far as accumulating enough data, 1 and even 2 litters is almost never enough, except for some extreme situations. And on top of that, we still have gilt availability and breeding target driving even those productivity decisions. In other words, you keep a sow that you don't like when you need to meet breeding target. If it is a cull for 2 returns and then you are out, or the sow is out, the same value in a 90% farrowing rate versus a 75% farrowing rate. And my emphasis is simply no, that it's more valuable with high farrowing rate, and variable herd performance precludes accuracy in predicting animal performance. Just wanted to emphasize that. Stephanie spent a long time in emphasizing different economic models for removal, and what she comes to is the value of the sow space and the productivity of the sow space. It makes no sense to talk about productivity of the sow. Culling is a decision to manage that sow space. An empty space is worse than a poor productivity sow in almost all cases, even though it makes pigs per sow per year look good. Culling for productivity is almost never tested correctly on the farm, and it's almost always overestimated in success rate by the farm manager. Adjusting for season can help that somewhat because there is seasonal predictiveness, and I'm going to argue that it's the condition of the sow that is actually driving the sow card, and in turn is a better measure. We've shown relationships in some cases between sow characteristics. It can be as simple as feed intake for a single day during farrowing, during lactation. If it's too low, for instance, the sow off feed for a day will increase the odds of removal by over 2 times due to a number of different factors. Anil published this in SHAP a couple of years ago. So there are characteristics at that level. There are also seasonality characteristics, such as the farrowing rate from the PigChamp database that shows that there's a repeatable challenge to the sows that should drive and moderate some of our decisions in culling as well. We should also recognize that mechanistically, when we talk about changes in season, the mechanisms by which we run into problems can differ. This is a graph of farrowing success or farrowing rate compared to the number of matings per service. And it shows that actually single mating works relatively well except for the summer months in this particular group of herds. And it's actually the interaction between single mating, which actually goes up during the summer, at the same time it becomes less successful. And we have to understand what's causing that interaction, and perhaps some of the suggestions from Mark are quite useful. I want to take you through this then, and our view on where we are. Number one is we're trying to get a measure of sows that should be culled. And we do that to a certain extent by looking at sows that are not culled based on rules in the past simply due to meeting breeding target. Lameness is a predictor of having to be culled, no doubt about that. Odds ratio of about 3 times as high of being a sow that should be culled. Lameness also predicts lower productivity. She's more likely to have lower productivity in the future. And this model, if we put lameness into the background, all of a sudden, what's interesting about this number of odds ratio equals 1, it means that productivity, without taking into account lameness, is not a good predictor of future productivity or the likelihood of being culled. And what we actually have to do is ignore lameness and then change that odds ratio, and productivity is only useful when the sow card is only useful when we use it as a proxy for looking at the sow. Hopefully that makes sense. The sow card is telling you something's wrong with the sow. But if you can already look at the sow and say something's wrong with that sow, shouldn't you be looking at the sow first? And lameness is a big part of that. And so we're getting, and studying this in a bit more detail, is understanding these are interactions or pathways towards survival in the herd. And claw lesions isn't the complete summarization of lameness. Lameness isn't the complete summarization of productivity, but it's there in the background dragging down our sows. And how much they're dragged down has been really surprising to us as we track through, for instance, comparing sows that were diagnosed lame going into the farrowing crate versus those that were not lame, diagnosed not lame going into the farrowing crate. There's huge differences in subsequent productivity of those sows. And it's much bigger than anything we can pull off the sow card. It's in the area of 20 to 30 times more predictive. And as Mark said, we can easily get those big fancy p-values that epidemiologists like that much. But it is a high predictor that isn't recorded in our record-keeping systems. And in this herd that we studied, 20% of the sows that entered the farrowing crate were lame. So we've got a number of different costs to associate with that culling decision. We do know with lameness there's higher turnover costs. There's lower productivity, lower salvage revenue, lower output quality. There's a replacement lag that when you cull an animal, you don't fill that space right away. There's increased care costs, increased pre-weaning mortality, and many less measurable outcomes. So we've got those challenges, and we know they're there. And just to take you through a quick exercise on a money basis, we've been arguing that, first of all, in this example where we studied, we had 21% of sows entering a farrowing crate lame. And our question was, how much does it cost that sow space to have a sow show up lame in the farrowing crate? Replacement cost in this case, this is a bit old, at $280. We monitored for 300 days post-farrowing. We had a salvage value, again, $80, a lameness discount due to lower weight and rejection, and discounts for lameness of $40, replacement lag of $15. There's a lameness effect upon the litter. We're seeing more and more, both in mortality but also in quality at weaning. We estimate here at $13. P1 litter discount for having a P1 gilt show up the next time with poor survivability in those progeny, we estimate at $50. Piglet price way too high at $38. Sorry, we went for rosier times. But this is a model to consider what the opportunities are, and I want to use it to just illustrate a few overall concerns. We saw, as Mark showed, there's differences in pigs born per day in these lame sows subsequent to weaning after being diagnosed lame. There's lower longevity. There's lower times in the herd. There's a higher replacement rate. They're more likely to die rather than be marketed. There's differences in the productivity in the sow space then. That sow that we identified as being lame is going to only produce 4.1 pigs on average in that sow space because it's going to be culled earlier and it's also going to be less productive. On average in that sow space, we're going to see over that 300 days another 10.5 pigs produced on average by the non-lame sows that we identified. Then we have replacement sows stepping into that sow space. In this case, because it's less time, it's going to be 6.5 piglets. In this case, it's going to be 8.7 piglets. And the total productivity in that sow space differs by about 4.3 piglets in this case. And so if we take those numbers and take a look at the cost of a diagnosis of lameness in a sow entering the farrowing crate upon that sow space, we come up with an estimate in this case of $242. It's going to be lower during lower pig prices, but in the long run, hopefully we're covering our costs. The emphasis I want to make is we're really worried about salvage value, and I've heard a lot of concern about that, but it's about $5 for that sow space. We're worried about replacement costs. We have to spend more time on the quality of the progeny, but the big cost of lameness is loss of output for that sow herd. And that productivity cost is something that hasn't been identified in many cases. So what are my suggested solutions? I think we have to recognize that there are discounts in progeny when we cull an animal. P1 discounts, lameness discounts. When we reevaluate culling, underneath my biases perhaps, but hopefully I've justified some of them at least, we see a reduction in performance-based culls. I question them, and we have a hard time justifying them. We increase welfare-based culls, lameness otherwise, condition of the animals, and in turn, we emphasize minimizing those culls through things that we can manipulate. If we model based on productivity per sow space, we see an increased consistency in demand because we're trying to flow the animals as evenly as possible rather than culling to meet pigs per sow per year. And we identify lags in replacement of animals as well as being a major problem in our herds. We prevent welfare-based decisions. We decrease performance-based culling, especially as herd performance goes down. There's almost a complete elimination of performance-based culling in the first two parities. We spend more time focusing on seasonality as a major insult towards the animals, and we spend more time on robustness of the animals and finding predictors for that as we reduce the productivity concerns. What's the problem we have right now? First of all, emphasize again, endpoint quality control doesn't work. Identifying a problem when the sow leaves doesn't tell you very much. We need to have traits that are preventable, and we need to understand the predictability of the conditions of the sows and the productivity that we have. There's wide variation across the industry in culling behavior and decisions on culling, so it's very difficult to make generalization. And even within farms, there's huge variation in application of culling decisions over time, over managers and the like. What else can we do? Of course, we have to re-examine the sows and what makes robust sows in terms of rearing, genotype, and care. We need good care and maintenance of these sows, emphasizing these aspects, and we need consistent production pressures and management. The more consistent our productivity is on the farm, the better off we are, or the more accurate we are in our decisions. I'm going to leave it at that. I just have this quote: you can do anything you set your mind to when you have vision, determination, and an endless supply of expendable labor. And in that turn, I'd like to especially thank my graduate students and even some of the veterinary students who have helped me with this over time. So thanks.